Unfortunately, my father passed away. I learned everything about the family business, and it was just me and my grandfather running it. I was starting to take reins of things because, well, my grandpa was about to retire. When I decided to tell my grandpa one small thing about me that he didn't know, I told him I'm gay. Well, his reaction was not what I hoped for because now he's telling me I better get the heck out of his house and he's trying to kick me from the family company. But I have a little secret hidden up my sleeve. Growing up in a family with very old-fashioned traditions, it was hard for me to be the kid that felt certain inclinations that did not see eye to eye with values I was brought up with. See, I'm an only child. That's a very bad thing when you're not a child that can be considered, normal. My parents died in an accident when I was 4 years old, and I hardly have any memories left with them on my brain. This left me in the hands of my grandparents from my father's side. They own a hardware store, and they have been quite successful with it. My mother and father both had jobs at the hardware store and made a good living. My grandfather had raised me to know all there was to know about the business. And I have to say, little by little, I was starting to get the idea of being the person in charge of the hardware store and just letting this be my way of life. My only issue is that I was constantly struggling with the idea of telling my grandfather that, well, I'm gay. It all happened because of something he said at the dinner table once. We were all sitting at the main dinner table having dinner. Grandmother was by the right side of grandfather, and I was sitting by his left side, and the empty chair on the other side of the table would usually be the place for all the food to be placed by the maid. So, my grandmother made a comment about this friend of hers who was dealing with having a gay son. Her son had apparently came out as gay after already having been married and having 3 kids. It was a shocking time for the whole family, but they got over it. When my grandfather heard that, he had a massive frown and looked of disgust upon his face that I will never forget. He stared at my grandmother and said, "Ugh, I'd rather be dead than hear about having a gay son." When my grandfather said those words, I felt a sudden jolt that froze me on the spot. I couldn't breathe, and I was screaming on the inside. Well, I remained completely unfazed in my external appearance, and I was so afraid that my grandfather would pick up on my real emotions as he said that. I was too afraid of that scenario, so I just sat there eating what was left of my dinner, feeling ashamed, insulted, scared, and angry all at the same time. I remember exactly 3 years after that, being 18 and finally having the courage to tell my grandparents that I was gay. It was a regular afternoon, and this meant that my grandfather would be sitting on the couch watching the same show every single day. I was turning 18 in just a few days, and I knew this meant I was free to leave if I wanted to. I didn't want to leave, but not because I didn't like living with my grandparents. No, that's not it. I wanted to leave just to experience the college life and to be a normal kid that flies away from the nest as a natural progression of life. So, I went over to my grandfather as he was sitting on his chair. I didn't even think of telling my grandmother first because I knew she would tell me to keep this a secret. She's the kind of person that believes that certain things are better left unsaid in order to keep the peace at home. I was determined to make this happen as I felt I had the right to live my life without any types of restraints regarding my sexual preferences. I didn't feel ashamed or guilty about it. I was not sort of a pervert. I was simply a homosexual person, and I had no reason to hide that. So, I was right in front of my grandfather, and I just stood there without saying anything. Well, he glanced at me and said, my boy, you need something." And that's when I just went ahead and said, "Grandpa, I'm gay." He kept watching the TV as if I hadn't said anything. Then about, 20 seconds later, he looked at me and said, "Ah, well, if that's true, you have about 60 seconds to get out of my house." Well, I stood there and looked at him, and my eyes filled with tears immediately as I asked him if he was being serious. He kept staring at the TV as he said to me, "Boy, I'm dead serious. my grandmother came storming into the room and asked both of us to calm down and talk things over. My grandfather said, "There's nothing to talk about, he has to leave." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I went from being trained to becoming the person in charge of the hardware store to being an unwanted individual that had to leave the house immediately. As if I was some sort of imposter or intruder, not his own blood and not the son of his son. Well, I told my grandmother I loved her and I didn't say another word to grandfather. I went into my room, packed some of the clothes I bought with my part-time job, and I just headed out. I immediately went to a friend's house that I knew would not let me sleep in the streets. He was also gay, and he knew how hard it was to be rejected by his own family. See, the next 3 years really helped shape me to the man that I am now. Absolutely. I had to work several jobs just to be able to afford rent in a place that was a good neighborhood. I was constantly just barely making ends meet, and I was always struggling. It was all a far cry from the life I was supposed to be living. The family-owned hardware store had made my grandparents quite wealthy, and it was doing the same for my parents. Not that I was facing the life of someone who had not really had to rely on but himself. Then, I get the phone call. It was from a friend of mine who kept in touch with the family. He told me that my only cousin had passed away due to a heart condition. My cousin, well, had been very close to me for many years when we were kids, and I knew that I had to go to the funeral just to pay my respect. But I dreaded the thought of having to see my grandfather there, but I also knew that I just had to be there. This was about my cousin, and it had nothing to do with the estranged relationship I had with my grandparents. Update number 1. Hey guys, well, while I was at the funeral, I decided the best way to handle this was to simply avoid my grandparents. I was greeted by many family members with a warm welcome, and some even told me that my grandfather was in the wrong for cutting me off the way that he did. I went in to look at my cousin and I felt very sad. Although I had not seen him for a while, I never did tell him I was gay. And I felt that I wanted to know how he would have felt about that. My uncle came up to me and saw me crying next to his son's casket. He told me that the sounding cared very much and about me, and he said he didn't mind if I was gay. He always supported me and told me grandfather that had no right to reject me the way that he did. When he said that, I was filled with gratitude and sadness. I was grateful that he stood up for me, but extremely sad that I would never get to thank him for it. I then went to say hi to other members of the family and stopped me in my tracks when I saw my grandfather and my grandmother a few steps ahead. Well, I immediately turned my back on them and went to talk to other family members outside the funeral home. My grandmother looked sad, but my grandfather looked completely unfazed by my presence. It was as if I've been erased from his memory altogether. It felt like the day his grandson told him he was gay was the day when the person died. I was dead to him, it seemed, and he did not have any remorse in his bones. He was asked to say a few words about my cousin, and he went on the podium and said that one of the greatest virtues that my cousin had was his ability to forgive and not hold a grudge. When he said that, he glanced at me for a second and then said, "But you know, some things just simply can't be forgiven." And that was the boiling point for me. I looked at him and called him a hypocrite. I used a very mild tone of voice, but I made sure that everybody could hear me. I said, "How dare you talk about forgiveness and then you say some things can't be forgiven? The only sin I ever committed was that I was gay, and you treated me like garbage." I remember that I felt like I was trapped inside a bubble and nobody could hear me or even see me. It was just my grandfather and me. He just stood there and didn't say a word while I turned away and started to walk out. 1 year passed since that, and I had once again become detached from my family. One day I received a call from someone who simply said, "Hey, your cousin left it all under your charge." Then the person hung up. I felt a rush of adrenaline when this person said that on the phone. Well, update
Number 2.
Just like it's been orchestrated to happen right after that, my phone rang and it was grandmother. She was telling me how much she missed me and how much she hoped that we could see each other again. She wanted to arrange a meeting and said that my grandfather was ready to let go of the past. I was hesitant as I've been absent for a whole other year, and I was finally starting to feel happy and comfortable with the fact, well, that I had no family anymore. I decided to think things over after a few days, and I decided to accept the invitation. I was greeted by my grandfather and my grandmother at his office where they had asked to see them. A veteran lawyer asked me to have a seat due to the importance of the news he was about to share with me. Well, okay. So I sat down. So, it turns out that my cousin had left a will and he had stated in it that if he was to fail ill or die or anything sudden, the reins of the hardware store would need to be given to nobody else other than me. That's right, me. I was taken aback by this comment, and then I was rudely brought back to reality when I realized that this meeting was all about my grandfather making sure I did not accept the company. I looked at him and said, "Hey, yeah, you wanted me here, so I could hand the company back to you, didn't you, buddy?" Well, my grandmother looked at me in tears as she could sense I was aware of what was happening. My grandfather quickly said in a commanding voice,
I didn't want you to be associated with my store, son, so I gave it to your cousin to retire and then realized that your cousin decided to do this and give it all to you. I'm sure you would not want it as it's not my wish to leave it to you."
Well, when he said that, I was enraged and filled with the need for revenge, so I told him that I was not only going to keep the hardware store. Oh no, I was going to do more than that. I was also going to be running it in a very, very different way. For starters, I was going to be donating profits to LGBTQ charities, of course. I was happy to donate, but my decision was mainly driven by my thirst for revenge. See, my grandmother looked at me in shock while grandfather's face turned red with anger. He couldn't believe that I was not only going to accept the hardware store, but also use it as a platform for social change.
I can't believe you would have done this,
grandfather yelled, slamming his fist on the table with a fury.
After all we've done for you, boy. This is how you repay us. I've raised you and I've given you food and shelter until you turned 18 and decide to become this abomination of a person.
I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure and say, "You're right. This is how I'm repaying you. Well, you didn't want to reconcile with me because you missed me or because you regretted your actions. You did it because my cousin left the store to me, and you wanted to take it away from me. Well, I'm not going to let that happen, Gramps. I'm going to use this opportunity to make a difference." My grandmother spoke up, with tears streaming down her face. "Please don't do this. We're family. We can work this out."
I looked at her sadly.
"Family? You mean the family that turned their backs on me and robbed me of my rightfulness? That's not family. Family's supposed to support and love each other unconditionally, and if you can't do that, then I have no choice but to sever ties with you." With that, I stood up and walked out the room, leaving my stunned grandparents behind. I knew that my decision would be radical, but I was determined to stand up for myself for what I actually believed in. Now, in the coming months, I took over the store and implemented my plan to donate a portion of the profits to LGBTQ+ charities. I also made sure that the store had inclusive policies and was safe space for all customers and employees, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. See, the store quickly gained a reputation as a progressive and inclusive business, and the community responded positively. Meanwhile, my relationship with my grandparents remained strained. They tried to reach out to me, but I kept my distance, unwilling to let go of my newfound independence and values that I really held dear. It was a difficult decision that I had to make, but I knew that it was the right decision. Despite all the challenges, I found fulfillment in running the hardware store and using it as a force for good in the community. The success of the business and the positive impact it was making on LGBTQ plus charities absolutely fueled my passion even more. You see, the success of the business and the positive impact it was making, well, fueled my passion. I can't even explain it anymore. I also found support from my friends and chosen family who stood by me through thick and thin. One day, my grandmother showed up at the store unexpectedly. She looked over at me, and well,
She looked older and frail, and her eyes were filled with regret.
she apologized for the mistakes she and grandfather have made and expressed her desires to make the amends. She even begged for my forgiveness and asked if we could simply start over. Touched by her sincerity, I decided I will give her a chance. We started rebuilding our relationship slowly, and over time I learned to forgive her. My grandfather, on the other hand, remained stubborn and just refused to acknowledge his mistakes. He continued to harbor resentment towards me and my business, but I didn't let it deter me from my mission. Years passed, and the hardware store continued to thrive. It became a symbol of inclusivity and acceptance in the community, and I was proud of the impact I was making. I expanded my charitable efforts, supporting not only the LGBTQ+, but way more. Update number 4.
Oh boy, strap your seats in, final update.
Hey guys, so after I took over the family hardware store, I threw myself into the business with determination and passion. I made several changes, modernizing the store and implementing new strategies to increase sales and profitability. One of my key decisions was to allocate a portion of the profits to LGBTQ+ charities and others, as a way to support a cause that was very dear to my heart and also despite my grandfather for his past actions. Given that, well, my grandfather was the founder of the company, he decided he was going to be back at the office out of retirement. His decision for this was not boredom, it was all about making my life miserable. One would think that my grandfather was finally ready to let go of his anger, but this was never the case. He was always hateful, and he kept reminding me of what an atrocity that I've become. He would refer to me as freak. I can only imagine now how horrible it must have been for my father to have such a deplorable dad. Despite my best efforts and the store's success, my grandfather's attitude towards me just simply did not change. It didn't. He continued to harbor resentment and hatred, making no efforts to hide his disappointment in having me as the successor of the family company. He criticized my decisions, belittled my accomplishments, and constantly tried to undermine my authority. His hostility towards me created a toxic work environment, even with some of the employees taking cues from him treating me with a disrespect. It was challenging to navigate the dynamics, but I remained steadfast in my commitment to running the business in the way that aligned with my values and beliefs. As time went on, the store's profits grew, and I continued to make substantial donations, making sure to share the impact of the contributions on social media. The further fueled grandfather's animosity towards me, as he saw it as a public display of defiance. One day, my grandfather confronted me at the store,
Expressing his disdain towards
my decision and accusing me of tarnishing the name of the family. He demands that I stop donating to LGBTQ+ charities and threatened to take legal action to regain his business. Well, despite his threats, I stood my ground and refused to back down. I told him that I was proud of the changes I've made to the business and the positive impact it was making on the community. I also made it very clear I had no intention of handing over the business to him or anybody else. My grandfather's anger boiled over, and he cut off all communication with me. He even tried to turn some family members against me, spreading lies and misinformation about the management of the business. However, I remained focused on my goals. I just felt extremely motivated by the thought of revenge, and started reading content that showed me how much revenge played a role in so many people's lives in so many ways. At the exact same time, I was using the business as a platform for promoting acceptance and inclusivity. Despite my grandfather's continued animosity, I never gave up, just seeking justice for my late cousin and making a positive impact through the business. The success of the store and the recognition it received, for its LGBTQ plus initiatives only fueled my determination to continue fighting for what I believed in. With that said, I started to set a plan in motion to finally remove grandfather from the business. I hired a private investigator and asked him to help me find out some dirt about grandfather. I needed to have something that I could use in order to confront him and force him out of the business. This was going to be something that would be tremendously helpful, and I know that I had to do it. I no longer even felt any type of emotional attachment to my grandfather. That wasn't any good way. I felt the complete opposite now. I didn't even feel bad for my grandmother because she had always enjoyed the financial benefits of being in such an evil man. I wanted to see grandfather hurting and even fearful of me. I was tired of his abuseful ways and all his insults. Then, a few weeks later, and thousands of dollars spent on the PI, I finally received a very valuable great news. The investigator found out that grandfather used to have a mistress. That's right, that he had hidden from grandmother all these years. You see, I honestly didn't think that was such a great find, but the private investigator paused for a second and said, "Oh wait,
There's more.
Your grandfather has a child with that woman, and the child's now a fully grown man, but he doesn't know who his father is." I felt strange for a second, and I took a pause. I had just realized that I had a half-brother out there, and I was curious to meet him. I knew that in order for my plan to work, I had to remain quiet about this newfound half-brother, at least for now. So I go to my grandfather's office, which he only used to sleep and watch TV at this point. He looked at me and said, "What the hell do you want?" I wrote a letter showing him all the evidence I had that he had a son with another woman, and the letter ended with me saying, "If you're not out of the office by forever, by the end of the day, this goes public." I hand him the letter and a sealed envelope and said, "I love you too, Grandpa. Enjoy." And I closed the door. For a minute, I was filled with fear that he would storm out of the office and make a scene, but the deed was done, and I had to wait for his reaction. I remember staying close to his office door just to hear him come out no more than 20 minutes later. He opened the door, and at that point, I immediately went to my office as I expected him to come out and confront me directly. I sat there and my stomach was in absolute knots, but the minute turned to close to an hour, and he never came in. I went outside and the receptionist told me that he left the building without even saying a word to anyone. I decided not to try to communicate with him or grandmother for 48 hours. So, I now get a call from grandmother saying that grandfather had decided to retire. He was gone, and I felt extremely satisfied that it worked. Well, now you can say, a few days later, he sent me a text message saying, "I'll see you in hell one day." Well played. I smiled, and I felt that I was done with the chapter of my life. My grandfather and I were even, and I feel that he needed that too. Now, I was still curious about my half-brother, though. The private investigator told me where he worked. He was the manager at a car dealership, and I intentionally asked to meet with him, pretending to want to buy a car. He was a polite and educated man that seemed to be doing good in life. I felt the urge to tell him who I was, but I knew I had to wait until my grandfather died, as my revenge would have worked as intended. I had to wait for my grandfather to die, but then I met with my father's ex-mistress and she begged me not to tell him the truth. I decide to agree to give this man, I'd been told that his real father was the man who raised him. As time passed by, my efforts with the store was recognized and celebrated by the community, and the store became a symbol of acceptance and support. My relationship with my family remained strained, but I found solace in knowing that I had made a difference in the lives of the LGBTQ community, and I'd sought justice for my late cousin in my own way. In the end, I learned that seeking revenge may not always bring the satisfaction one expects. In my case, it brought some peace, but not so much satisfaction. Staying true to one's values and making a positive impact can bring a sense of fulfillment and purpose. I continued to run the business with integrity, proud of the legacy I was creating and positive change I was making in the world. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Well, I just want to say good for Luke, standing up for yourself, and you should not be judged based on your sexual orientation and preference. The grandfather was completely out of line in this story, and many commenters thought so too. A lot of commenters were saying, though, how they do feel bad for the grandma. A lot of people are saying that she was emotionally bound to the grandfather since they were together for so long, but you could tell based on her emotions and the way she was reacting to it. She was, well, feeling so bad that this was happening to her family, and she did not agree with Grandpa. But on the other side of the coin, there were a lot of commenters who were saying it doesn't matter if the grandma knew it was wrong. She didn't do anything to stop the grandpa, so she's just as bad as him. I would like to know where you guys lie in that conversation. Are you on grandma's side for this one, or do you think that she could have simply done more? Well, we know how it all ended. OP decides to cut the contact. I would like to know what you guys think of it, so drop your comments down below. My name's Mr. Reddito. I read stories every single day. If you're bored, want to come check it out, kill some time, stop on by, see what the subject is today. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.